There is a photograph that exists in the Library of Congress archives. A single railroad track stretching into the horizon. Empty. Silent. And if you did not know what it was used for, you would see nothing unusual about it. But this track is not a trade route. It is not a passenger line. It is the road that 250,000 children traveled down, one way, and not a single one of them was told where they were going. This is not a story about trains. This is a story about what happens when a society decides that certain children are a problem to be solved, and what lengths powerful men will go to when they need that problem to disappear quietly. We begin in 1853, Lower Manhattan. A young minister named Charles Loring Brace walks the streets at night and counts. He counts the children sleeping in doorways, children selling matches in the rain, children so young they cannot yet write their own names, already working 12-hour days in factories that will kill them before they turn 30. By his own estimate, there are between 10,000 and 30,000 of them, uncounted, unnamed, invisible to the city that built its wealth on their labor. Brace calls them the dangerous classes, not because they are dangerous to themselves, because they are dangerous to the men who own the city, because that many desperate, hungry children growing up together in the same streets could become something that no police force could contain. Brace has a solution. Remove them. All of them. Send them somewhere far away where the air is clean and the land is open and nobody will have to think about them anymore. He calls it placing out. History will call it the orphan train movement. And for 75 years, it will be called one of the greatest acts of charity in American history. It was not charity. It was something else entirely. And the railroad tracks will tell you what it actually was, if you know how to read them. The Children's Aid Society opened its doors in 1853. Within 1 year, it had more funding than almost any charitable organization in New York. The donors were not ordinary citizens moved by the suffering of street children. The names in the donation ledgers read like a map of American industrial power. Railroad executives, merchant bankers, land developers with hundreds of thousands of acres of underpopulated Western territory that needed workers to become profitable. These men did not fund the Children's Aid Society because they loved children. They funded it because they had a problem. And Brace's program was the most elegant solution anyone had ever proposed. The Erie Railroad offered deeply discounted cars for the orphan trains almost immediately. Not because railroad executives were compassionate, because those same railroads owned land grants across the Midwest and needed those territories populated enough to generate freight revenue. You do not build a railroad through empty land. You need towns. You need farms. You need workers. And workers cost money. Children cost almost nothing. The first train left New York in 1854. 45 children. Destination? Rural Michigan. The children were told they were going to good homes in the country. They were not told the name of the family. They were not told the name of the town. They were not given any address where a biological parent or sibling could reach them. They were told to be grateful. And they were told not to ask too many questions. Most of them never saw New York again. By 1860, the trains were running regularly. By 1870, they had reached as far as Kansas, Nebraska, and Texas. The routing decisions, which towns received children, which counties were selected, which communities were placed on the schedule, were made by the Children's Aid Society in coordination with local agents. And those routing decisions followed a pattern that the society never publicly acknowledged. A researcher working in the Kansas State Historical Society archives in the 1990s overlaid the orphan train stop records against fire insurance underwriter reports filed with the state legislature between 1860 and 1880. Those insurance reports documented every town-level fire serious enough to trigger a commercial loss claim. They were actuarial documents, precise, dry, unambiguous. When the two records were placed side by side, the pattern was immediate and undeniable. Town burns. 3 to 7 years later, orphan train arrives. Not occasionally, not coincidentally, consistently. Across Kansas, across Illinois, across Georgia and Michigan and Missouri and Nebraska. The burned towns needed labor. The children arrived to provide it.
In 1871, Fresno County, California, lost approximately 40% of its agricultural infrastructure to fire. Orphan train stops in Fresno County began appearing in placement records within 4 years. In 1873, a fire across 3 counties in central Illinois destroyed grain storage and killed between 12 and 20 farm workers. Seasonal migrants whose deaths were not consistently documented because their lives were not considered worth documenting. Orphan train stops in those same counties appear by 1876. The pattern holds everywhere the researcher looked, and the mechanism is not mysterious once you understand the economics. A town that is recently burned is a town in active reconstruction. Reconstruction needs labor. Children are labor that arrives without wages, without contracts, without legal protections, without the ability to leave. The placement agreement signed by the receiving family was legally binding on the child, not on the family. If the placement was abusive, the child had no legal recourse. If the child ran, they were categorized as vagrant and returned to the same institutional system they had been removed from. The system was closed by design. This is where the documents become deeply uncomfortable, because the Children's Aid Society kept records, meticulous records, and those records reveal that the organization was not measuring what it claimed to be measuring. Brace's organization tracked placements by something he called industrial absorption, a metric that measured whether the child had been integrated into productive labor within the receiving household. Letters from receiving families were evaluated based on one criterion: whether the arrangement was satisfactory to the family, not whether the child was safe, not whether the child was educated, whether the family was satisfied with what they had received. The families were the customers, the children were the product, and the railroad was the delivery system. In 1882, a placement agent named Catherine Sellers wrote a letter to her supervisor from a route in central Iowa. She had concerns. The boys from a previous placement cohort were working excessively hard. Their schooling was minimal. She described the labor as intensive for their ages. She asked one question: should we continue sending children to this community? Her supervisor replied in 3 sentences. He acknowledged her concern. He noted that the receiving families had expressed satisfaction. He instructed her to proceed. Catherine Sellers continued making placements in that community for 4 more years. Her letter is still in the archive. Her supervisor's response is still there beside it. 3 sentences. That was the entire answer to a question about children being worked past their limits. The families are satisfied. Continue. That metric, satisfaction of the receiving family, was the only one that ever mattered. The oral history record is where the human cost becomes impossible to look away from. In 1936 and 1937, WPA interviewers traveled across the Midwest, collecting testimony from elderly Americans who had lived through this period. Several described the arrival of the orphan trains not as a charitable occasion, but as something closer to a livestock market. Children lined up on platforms, in church halls, farmers walking through and selecting. One testimony from a man in Pottawatomie County, Kansas, identified only as J.H. in the records, interviewed in 1937, describes watching an arrival as a boy of approximately 9 years old. He says the bigger boys were the ones the farmers wanted first. The smaller ones waited longer. One boy younger than him sat on his trunk for most of the afternoon, still sitting there when his family left. He does not know what happened to that boy. That boy, if placed that day, would have grown up in Pottawatomie County, working land that had been through at least 2 significant fire events in the preceding decade. He would have had no way to contact a biological family. He would have had no address, no name, no before. He would have had grandchildren, and those grandchildren would have been told a family story that began, for all practical purposes, with an arrival, a trunk on a platform, a farm in Kansas. No before. The orphan train movement operated for 75 years. It ended in 1929, not because the society had a change of conscience. It ended because the Great Depression had flooded rural communities with unemployed adults who were now cheaper than children. The economic logic that had created the program was reversed, and so the program ended, quietly, without accountability.
Without any systematic effort to locate the children who had been placed, without any acknowledgement of what the routing patterns actually revealed. The Society published a final report describing the program as an imperfect but well-intentioned effort in child welfare. The burn maps were not included in that report. The industrial absorption metrics were not discussed. The Catherine Sellers letter was not mentioned. The testimony of J.H. from Pottawatomie County was not referenced. The report said the program had served the children. The documents say something different. The documents say the children served the program, and the program served the railroads, and the railroads serve the men whose names appear at the top of the donor ledgers. And those men built the foundations of American industrial wealth on the labor of children who arrived on trains to burned towns that needed their hands. The track in that photograph does not lead to good homes in the country. It leads to the question that not one of those 250,000 children was ever given enough information to ask. Where did you find us? And why here? And why now? The documents know the answer. The children never did.